Rock and roll, 1940s to 1950s. Rock and roll began in the American South when African American rhythm and blues, gospel, and boogie-woogie collided with white country and western. The sound was raw, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Even the name carried energy. Before it described music, rock and roll meant everything from the motion of a ship to slang for until Cleveland DJ Alan Freed used it on the radio in 1951 and made it stick. The early sparks came from pioneers who blurred boundaries. Sister Rosetta Tharpe fused gospel with blistering electric guitar, and Goree Carter pushed distortion before distortion had a name. Chuck Berry duck-walked across stages with riffs sharp enough to define the genre, while Elvis Presley turned hips, swagger, and charisma into a cultural earthquake. For teenagers, this music was liberation. For parents, it was chaos, quickly condemned as the devil's sound. But just as fast as it rose, rock and roll nearly collapsed. Elvis was shipped off to the army. Little Richard left to preach. Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis were sidelined by scandals. And in 1959, a plane crash killed Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper, remembered as the day the music died. In their absence, safer sounds filled the charts. The sunny harmonies of surf rock, Motown's polished soul, and Phil Spector's layered wall of sound, which sometimes felt less like music and more like an attempt to drown listeners in violins. For a brief moment, rock's rebellion looked finished, but across the Atlantic, a new wave was about to send it roaring back, this time with a British accent. The British Invasion, 1960s. By the early 60s, American rock looked like it had lost its teeth. Then came the British Invasion, a cultural shockwave that sent rock and roll back to the United States, now with sharper edges and sharper suits. Bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had grown up obsessively studying imported American blues and R&B records. They re-exported the music back across the Atlantic, recharged, reimagined, and wrapped in an accent that made American teens lose their minds. The Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 wasn't just a performance, it was a detonation. Millions of viewers saw four young men with matching haircuts unleash a sound that felt familiar and brand new at the same time. The Rolling Stones offered a rougher, dirtier take on blues revival, presenting themselves as the dangerous alternative to the Beatles' clean-cut image. And then came The Who, bringing explosive live shows, feedback-drenched guitars, and the audacity to smash their instruments on stage. With songs like My Generation, they gave the movement a raw, rebellious edge that pushed rock further toward the chaos of punk. The Invasion didn't just revive American interest in rock, it splintered it into endless new directions. Psychedelia took hold as the counterculture bloomed, pushing music away from quick singles and towards sprawling albums that turned the studio into a playground. By the end of the decade, rock wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was art, rebellion, and identity all rolled into one. Psychedelic rock, late 1960s. By the late 60s, rock had wandered into stranger, mind-bending territory, and that world was painted in tie-dye. Psychedelic rock was shaped by the counterculture and fueled, quite literally, by hallucinogens. This was music designed to stretch your mind as much as your ears. Songs grew longer. Guitars were drenched in effects, and the recording studio stopped being a workplace and became an instrument in its own right. The Beatles pushed the boundaries with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, while Pink Floyd built entire soundscapes that felt less like songs and more like trips. In America, Jefferson Airplane sang of white rabbits and acid dreams, while the Doors brought a darker, more poetic edge. Jim Morrison's brooding voice and Ray Manzarek's organ turned songs like Light My Fire and Riders on the Storm into hypnotic journeys. At the same time, Creedence Clearwater Revival went in the opposite direction, keeping it raw, swampy, and stripped down with hits like Fortunate Son and Bad Moon Rising, proving psychedelic excess wasn't the only path forward. And then there was Jimi Hendrix, who took the guitar to places no one thought possible, with feedback, distortion, and fire. Literally fire in his case. Psychedelic rock wasn't just music, it was a cultural experiment. But it also created a fork in the road. Some musicians saw rock as high art, pushing it toward complexity and virtuosity. Others got tired of the endless solos and wanted music that hit fast and hard. That split defined the 1970s, and it led directly to the birth of progressive rock, punk rock, and heavy metal. Progressive rock, early 1970s. Progressive rock, or simply prog, was born when musicians decided rock didn't have to be 3 minutes of verse and chorus. It could be grand, complex, and even intellectual. Songs stretched past the 10-minute mark, albums turned into concept pieces, and technical virtuosity became the standard. Yes, dazzled audiences with intricate arrangements and soaring vocals. Genesis blended theatrical storytelling with shifting time signatures. King Crimson bent rock into something experimental and unsettling. Pink Floyd refined the psychedelic legacy into epic concept albums, with The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here turning into cultural milestones. Prog was ambitious, layered, and unapologetically serious. For fans, it was a revelation that rock could rival classical music in scope. For critics, it was often indulgent, the sound of musicians disappearing into their own solos. Either way, progressive rock stretched the definition of what rock music could be. Punk rock, mid to late 1970s. Punk rock exploded as a reaction to everything prog and arena rock had become. Where progressive bands built 20-minute epics, punk bands built songs so short you could blink and miss them. 3 chords, blistering speed, raw lyrics, and an attitude that spat in the face of authority. That was the formula. In New York, the Ramones fired off tracks that rarely passed the 2-minute mark, proving music didn't need complexity to be powerful. In London, the Sex Pistols turned chaos into a cultural revolution, with Anarchy in the UK shaking Britain to its core. The Clash fused punk's fury with sharp political messages, showing the genre could be as thoughtful as it was aggressive. Punk wasn't about polish. It was about tearing down the bloated excess of the 70s and replacing it with urgency. The hair was spiked, the clothes were ripped, and the songs were weapons. For fans, it wasn't just music, it was rebellion they could shout along to. Heavy metal and hard rock, 1970s to 1980s. Heavy metal emerged when rock decided to get darker, louder, and heavier than ever before. It grew out of the blues rock tradition, but everything was amplified. Distortion pushed to its limits, riffs slowed and thickened, and lyrics that often reached into the mystical, the menacing, and the taboo. Black Sabbath laid the blueprint with ominous, down-tuned guitars and songs about war, doom, and the supernatural. Led Zeppelin blended blues-inspired rock with thunderous power and mythological imagery. Deep Purple cranked up the intensity with blistering solos and organ duels, while Judas Priest sharpened the sound into pure metallic precision. And then came AC/DC, who cut through the complexity with raw, riff-driven hard rock. Their no-frills approach and explosive live shows made them one of the most dependable forces in rock history, with Back in Black becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time. The look mattered too. Leather, studs, and an image as fierce as the sound. To outsiders, heavy metal felt like noise, even danger. But to fans, it was liberation through volume, an escape into a world where the louder it got, the more alive you felt. Glam metal in the MTV era, 1980s. The 1980s didn't just change how rock sounded, it changed how it looked. With the launch of MTV in 1981, image became just as important as music, and glam metal was built for television. Big hair, makeup, leather, and spandex dominated the screen, and every guitar solo came with a pose. Bands like Motley Crue, Poison, and Twisted Sister filled arenas with songs that were equal parts heavy riffs and pop hooks. Bon Jovi's anthems blurred the line between metal and pop radio, while Guns N' Roses injected raw grit into the same world of spectacle. These bands weren't just musicians, they were rock stars turned larger-than-life characters. The videos mattered almost as much as the music. MTV turned looks into hits, and for a while, glam metal was unstoppable. But all the hairspray and neon excess came at a cost. By the end of the decade, another scene was waiting in the shadows, ready to tear it all down with flannel and fuzz. Grunge, 1990s. By the early 90s, the glitter of glam metal had started to feel hollow. Fans were growing tired of power ballads, perfect hair, and MTV-ready excess. Out of the Pacific Northwest came something very different, grunge. It was heavy, raw, and unpolished by design. A deliberate rejection of everything the 80s had built. Seattle was the epicenter. Nirvana's Nevermind blasted onto the charts in 1991 with Smells Like Teen Spirit becoming an anthem for disillusioned youth who felt alienated by the shiny promises of the previous decade. Pearl Jam's 10 offered introspective lyrics and stadium-sized power. Soundgarden pushed the genre's heaviness with Chris Cornell's soaring vocals, while Alice in Chains fused grunge with darker metal-inspired riffs. The sound was defined by distorted guitars, sludgy bass, and production that left the edges rough instead of polishing them smooth. The lyrics were often bleak: disillusionment, depression, frustration with society, themes that connected deeply with a generation that didn't buy into the glamour of the 80s. The flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and thrift store fashion weren't just style choices, but statements. Music that refused to play the image game. But grunge had an irony built into it. The more it rejected mainstream culture, the more mainstream it became. Suddenly, record labels were chasing every Seattle band with a guitar, and the underground sound was a global product. For some, this felt like the movement's undoing. For others, it proved grunge had struck a chord too deep to ignore. Alternate rock, 1990s to 2000s. When grunge's first wave faded, rock didn't disappear. It shifted into something broader. Alternative rock. Unlike classic rock, which thrived on familiar riffs, or punk, which thrived on raw simplicity, alternative rock was defined by its refusal to be defined. It became the umbrella for bands that didn't fit neatly into pop, punk, or metal, but still wanted guitars at the center of their sound. In the United States, REM had already opened the door in the 1980s with jangly guitars and literate lyrics, proving a band with outsider energy could also climb the charts. The Smashing Pumpkins expanded the range in the 1990s, layering heavy riffs, orchestral production, and emotional intensity on albums like Siamese Dream and Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness. Radiohead then redefined the possibilities of alternative rock. With OK Computer, they created a dense, futuristic masterpiece. And with Kid A, they pushed beyond guitars entirely, fusing rock with electronic experimentation. Their evolution showed that alternative rock wasn't limited by tradition. It could reinvent itself completely and still connect with millions. By the 2000s, alternative rock was still a broad church. Muse fused alt-rock with operatic ambition and heavy guitar theatrics. Bands like Modest Mouse and The Killers added indie and new wave flavors, keeping the genre unpredictable. Even Linkin Park, though more often labeled nu metal, borrowed heavily from alternative's crossover appeal. Alternative rock wasn't one single sound. It was the space where rock could evolve without repeating the past, where bands had freedom to experiment but still reach massive audiences. For a generation raised in the 90s and early 2000s, it became the new center of gravity for guitar music. Britpop, 1990s. Britpop was more than just a genre. It was a cultural movement that defined Britain in the mid-1990s. Born partly as a reaction to grunge's gloom and American dominance, Britpop was unapologetically British. It celebrated working-class identity, everyday life, and the traditions of British guitar pop from the 1960s. Oasis led the charge with swaggering anthems like Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger, positioning themselves as heirs to the Beatles. Blur offered a sharper, more iconic take with songs like Park Life, mixing social commentary with playful melodies. Pulp, with Jarvis Cocker's witty lyricism, explored sex, class, and suburbia in different class. Suede brought glam, flair, and moody atmosphere, while bands like Elastica kept the sound punchy and minimalist. Britpop wasn't just about the music, it was also about rivalry. The Battle of Britpop between Oasis and Blur in 1995 turned into a tabloid spectacle, with record sales and insults traded like weapons. The movement briefly dominated UK culture, putting guitar bands back at the center of the charts. By the late 1990s, though, Britpop's momentum faded. Overexposure, internal conflicts, and changing tastes brought the era to a close. But its influence lingered, laying the foundation for the next wave, Post-Britpop, late 1990s to 2000s. When Britpop's sharp edges dulled, a softer, more introspective sound took its place. Often called Post-Britpop, these bands kept the melodic guitar focus but shed the tabloid bravado, leaning into moodier, more atmospheric songwriting. Coldplay emerged in 2000 with Parachutes, offering delicate ballads like Yellow and Trouble. They became global superstars by combining Britpop's melodic roots with a more emotional, universal approach. Travis had already paved the way with The Man Who, while Snow Patrol rose with sweeping anthems like Chasing Cars. Keane stood out by replacing guitars with pianos, crafting soaring pop-rock songs that still felt grounded in Britpop's legacy. Post-Britpop bands were less about rivalry and more about introspection. Their songs often carried themes of longing, relationships, and personal reflection, set against grand cinematic backdrops. While Britpop had been about identity and swagger, Post-Britpop was about emotion and atmosphere. Together, Britpop and its aftermath carried British guitar rock from the 1990s into the 2000s, giving the UK two distinct waves that influenced global rock culture in very different ways. Pop-punk, 1990s to 2000s. Pop-punk was the sound of teenage rebellion made catchy enough for the radio. It took the speed and simplicity of punk rock and mixed it with the hooks and melodies of pop, creating songs that were loud, fast, and impossible not to sing along to. Green Day lit the fuse in 1994 with Dookie, an album that blasted through the charts with bratty humor and infectious energy. Blink-182 took it even further, turning pop rock into a cultural phenomenon with tongue-in-cheek singles like All the Small Things and What's My Age Again? Sum 41 mixed skate punk energy with metal riffs, while Good Charlotte and Simple Plan leaned into angsty lyrics that spoke directly to high school outsiders. The sound was polished compared to classic punk, but the attitude was still there, just delivered with a wink. Pop punk dominated MTV. Warped Tour became its traveling circus, and for a moment in the early 2000s, it felt like every teenager with a skateboard also had a pop punk anthem blasting in their headphones. Though critics sometimes dismissed it as lightweight or juvenile, its cultural impact was undeniable. Pop punk gave a generation of kids their first taste of rebellion, with enough melody that parents could still hum along from the other room. Post-grunge, late 1990s to 2000s. After grunge burned bright and fast, the sound didn't vanish. It evolved into something cleaner and more radio-friendly. Post-grunge kept the heavy guitars and angst, but stripped away the raw lo-fi edge, replacing it with polished production and arena-ready choruses. Foo Fighters led the way. Dave Grohl took the ashes of Nirvana and rebuilt them into a band that could fill stadiums with anthems like Everlong and The Pretender. Creed sold millions with soaring spiritual-sounding hits like With Arms Wide Open. Nickelback became the face of the genre in the 2000s, dominating radio with slick, riff-driven songs like How You Remind Me. Other bands like Bush, Puddle of Mudd, and Three Doors Down filled playlists with a similar mix of grunge-inspired grit and mainstream accessibility. For critics, post-grunge often felt too safe. Rebellion smoothed into a marketable product. But for millions of fans, it was the soundtrack of the late 90s and early 2000s. Music that captured emotion while still blasting loud from car stereos and filling arenas worldwide. Nu metal, late 1990s to 2000s. If post-grunge smoothed out grunge's rough edges, nu metal tore the genre in a completely different direction. Emerging in the late 1990s, nu metal fused heavy metal's aggression with hip-hop's rhythms, funk's grooves, and a dose of electronic experimentation. The result was heavy, confrontational, and unlike anything that had come before. Korn set the tone with down-tuned guitars and Jonathan Davis's tortured vocals, creating a sound both raw and unsettling. Limp Bizkit brought rap rock swagger, mixing DJ scratches with riffs and Fred Durst's aggressive delivery. Linkin Park took the formula mainstream with Hybrid Theory, blending metal riffs, electronic textures, and the dual vocal attack of Chester Bennington and Mike Shinoda. System of a Down added political fury and experimental twists, while bands like Slipknot turned nu metal into pure spectacle. 9 masked members pounding on drums and growling through chaos. For many fans, nu metal was the voice of late 90s alienation, the frustration of growing up in a world that felt increasingly corporate and disconnected. Critics often dismissed it as shallow or gimmicky, but it dominated MTV, filled arenas, and sold millions. At its peak, nu metal was less a subgenre and more a cultural phenomenon. The last time rock felt truly dangerous in the mainstream spotlight. Indie rock and the garage rock revival, 2000s. In the early 2000s, just as rock risked drowning in glossy production, a new wave brought guitars crashing back into focus. The Strokes lit the fuse with Is This It?, a lean, stripped-down record that made garage rock cool again. The White Stripes followed with raw, blues-soaked minimalism and an anthem in Seven Nation Army that would echo through stadiums for decades. Around them, the scene exploded. Yeah Yeah Yeahs added art punk edge. Interpol delivered moody post-punk revival. Franz Ferdinand brought sharp, danceable riffs, and Arctic Monkeys turned witty British storytelling into global anthems. Kings of Leon, too, began in this revival before expanding into arena-filling rock. Together, these bands defined the indie rock revival, a movement that rejected polish in favor of grit, energy, and style, proving that rock could still reinvent itself for a new generation. Emo and emo-pop, 2000s. In the 2000s, another branch of rock spoke directly to teenage angst, heartbreak, and identity. Emo. Originally rooted in the hardcore punk scene of the 1980s, emo evolved into a mainstream powerhouse by the mid-2000s, blending confessional lyrics with soaring hooks. Bands like My Chemical Romance turned personal pain into theatrical rock operas, with The Black Parade becoming the defining album of the era. Fall Out Boy brought a poppier edge, pairing witty, verbose lyrics with choruses built for radio. Paramore added fiery energy, driven by Hayley Williams' powerhouse vocals. Dashboard Confessional leaned into stripped-down acoustic vulnerability, while Panic at the Disco fused emo's drama with cabaret flair and pop experimentation. Emo's look was as iconic as its sound. Black eyeliner, skinny jeans, studded belts, and hair swept dramatically across the face. For its fans, it wasn't just music, it was an identity. Critics often dismissed it as melodramatic, but for a generation, emo was the loudest, most honest voice for growing pains, loneliness, and the struggle to be understood. Modern metal and hard rock, 2000s to today. While rock's presence on the charts had faded, heavy music never went away. It just kept evolving. In the 2000s, bands like Slipknot pushed metal into chaotic new territory, mixing crushing riffs with 9 masked members pounding on stage in controlled mayhem. System of a Down used sharp riffs and political fury to stand apart, while Tool built sprawling, intricate songs that blurred the line between metal and progressive rock. Meanwhile, the classic giants refused to fade. Metallica filled stadiums well into the 21st century, proving heavy metal could still draw bigger crowds than almost anyone. Iron Maiden, AC/DC, and Guns N' Roses continued to tour globally, with new generations discovering them through live shows rather than radio. A younger wave of bands took inspiration from both metal and hardcore punk, sparking the rise of metalcore and related styles. Groups like Killswitch Engage, Bring Me the Horizon, and Avenged Sevenfold blended breakdowns, screams, and soaring choruses into a sound built for modern festivals. Even newer acts like Architects and Spirit Box show how heavy music has adapted for the streaming era. Still aggressive, but often layered with atmosphere and electronic elements. Modern metal and hard rock may not dominate the mainstream charts, but in live arenas and festival fields, the energy remains unmatched. For fans, it's not background music, it's a full-body experience, as intense today as it was when Sabbath first dropped their riffs 50 years ago. Rock today. In the streaming era, rock no longer rules the charts. Hip-hop and pop dominate there. But on stage, rock still towers. The Rolling Stones, U2, and Metallica pull record-breaking crowds, and classics from Queen to Nirvana keep topping playlists for the new generations on Spotify and TikTok. Even Gen Z has sparked a revival. Machine Gun Kelly turned from rap to pop punk. Olivia Rodrigo sneaked guitars back into the top 40. And old emo anthems are trending again through memes and viral videos. Rock may not be the center of pop culture anymore, but it refuses to fade, surviving not as the sound of now, but as the sound that never dies. If you enjoyed rocking out with us, then don't forget to subscribe.